and welcome to this very special program on the state of the economy, the macro fundamentals and the challenges and opportunities facing Nirmala Sitharamn as she gets down to doing the tightrope walking that is part and parcel of budget formulation in our country. And who better to do that kind of navel gazing as also crystal gazing than with two of the best macroeconomic experts in the country. Soumyaran Chakravarti, Managing Director, Chief Economist, India, Citi Research, Citigroup Global Markets India Private Limited, and Indranil Sengupta, India Economist, Bank of America Securities. Welcome to the show, Soumyaran, Indranil. Let me start by asking both of you in turn, just to get the elephant out of the room. How do you assess the state of the Indian economy? Is it in need of support, or are all these fears just overrated? Soumyaran.
Well, in our view, Indian economy is passing through somewhat of a softer growth period, and this has started, in our view, quite a while back. So part of the problem is almost structural in nature, and there is a bit of it which is cyclical also. But clearly, when growth is at a 6-year low and inflation is at a 5-year high, the macro backdrop for the budget is a difficult one. And the expectations are also extremely diverse, from stimulating the economy to structural reforms to address the structural growth concerns. There's everything that people are expecting out of this budget. So I would say that while the positive parts are that the currency is very stable, the interest rates are more or less stable, so that way the macro imbalances are not something that the finance minister will have to immediately worry about.
Indranil, Soumyaran says that the slowdown has been here for some time. In which case, why is it that suddenly everybody seems to be very concerned about it and talking about it, whereas there was very little talk about any kind of fiscal support, monetary support, maybe even a year ago when she first presented her budget in July last year. So what has really changed? Because as Soumyaran says, the macro fundamentals are not too bad. The currency is stable, we don't have a current account deficit, so interest rates are not so high. So what is it that is about the present situation that has made everybody so concerned, Indranil?
Well, the economy is obviously going through, in our view at least, a very, very deep cyclical slowdown. And the genesis of this slowdown was in the liquidity crunch of 2018. Of course, after Governor Das took over, the RBI has cut rates, proactively provided liquidity. But what has happened is that core WPI inflation, which measures the pricing power of corporates, has collapsed. So while your MCLR in nominal terms has fallen by 45 basis points since March on RBI easing, the real MCLR has shot up 85 basis points because core WPI inflation has come down. So effectively speaking, we are going through 2 years of monetary shocks. One, the one this year really because of global factors that, the RBI may not have much to do about. So clearly this is a situation which needs support. We do expect the RBI to cut again, and we do expect, some sort of fiscal support to demand in this budget from the finance minister.
Soumyaran, Indranil seems to put the blame largely on monetary policy, saying that interest rates were kept unduly high and there was very little tracking of what was happening on the inflation front and the neglect of the WPI, etc. But we're talking in terms of the budget. So as he himself said, as Indranil himself said, we now looking to the government for some kind of fiscal support. So once we accept that the economy is in need of support, and this support, courtesy the budget, has to come by way of fiscal support, what should this take? What order should this take? Some easing of the fiscal deficit? What is your best guess? Or what should she aim? Not this year, because this year is largely done. What should the fiscal deficit target be for the next year, FY21?
Yeah, so on one hand, extraordinary times requires extraordinary measures. So I'm kind of a reluctant converter in saying that maybe the government can experiment with a slightly higher deficit number even for next year. But given what we have seen from this government over the last few years, our baseline view is that the government will opt for to start the year with a slightly lower or similar kind of fiscal deficit number as has been the case in FY20. The primary reason for this is that while we are a lot focused on the deficit trajectory, what we are omitting is the public debt trajectory. Our estimate is that the public debt to GDP ratio has already gone up to about 72.5%. And if we do not press the brakes right now on fiscal deficit, then we will definitely have to shift the FRBM mandated fiscal year 25, 60% of public debt to GDP ratio by at least 2 to 3 years, if not more. So from a debt perspective, I think we are in a very tricky situation now. So our ability to expand the fiscal deficit is limited not by inflation. Inflation is not that big a concern, but public debt is something which is a concern. The completely out of the box thinking is that if the government changes the FRBM targets again and says that 60% is not the mandated number by FY25, it's a different number, then obviously you can create fiscal space out of it. But if you have to stick to the FRBM, then the fiscal space appears to be quite limited.
Indranil, what is the great sanctity about sticking to somewhat arbitrary targets, whether it are for the fiscal deficit or the public debt? We look at Japan, the public debt has been over 100% of GDP for many, many years. This is not to argue for complete fiscal profligacy, but is there not some logic about looking at fiscal deficit in terms of over an economic cycle rather than looking at point to point? I frankly have found the government's obsession with a certain number as very difficult to comprehend at a time when the economy is slowing down. What's the idea of having a patient who's dead, beautiful, well preserved, but dead? Is it not more important to have the patient in reasonable good health? After all, public debt to GDP is a function also of GDP. So which comes first, chicken or egg? Indranil?
Well, we clearly believe that fiscal expansion is the need of the hour. And we are looking at the Finance Minister targeting a fiscal deficit of 3.5% of GDP, which is 50 basis above, the 3% that the FRBM Act and the Encasing Committee allows. Our view is that, in India and indeed in many other countries, it is growth which drives the fiscal deficit rather than the other way around. So, when you have an upcycle, for example, in 2005 to 2007, you have high growth, higher tax collections, and fiscal deficit looks very low. Then, if you have a great financial crisis, growth falls, tax collections fall, and the fiscal deficit looks very high. So, fiscal deficit at the end of the day has got to be counter-cyclical. And when more does it need to be counter-cyclical than now?
Incredible as it sounds, I think all three of us are in agreement that this is a time when the economy needs some support. That support has to come in the form of fiscal easing, and it has to come in the form of kind of being a little bit more relaxed with the fiscal deficit to GDP ratio. But once we accept that, there are very different ways of reaching that fiscal deficit target. Either you can do it by giving tax sops, cut giveaways, etc., or you can have this by government directly spending. Which of the two options would you think is better, Samiran? Government giving, extravagant, I'm using the word extravagant because given the way the tax GDP ratio is, almost any giveaway in the form of, whether it is tax cuts, whether in terms of basic income, these all would necessarily be extravagant. Or should it be in the form of government directly spending on infrastructure? Samiran?
So in my book, any fiscal stimulus will have to satisfy the condition of 3 T's. It has to be timely, targeted, and temporary. So based on the principle of these 3 T's, I would think that a tax cut is more difficult because what will happen is that it's too targeted. It only satisfies 2 to 3% of the population's demand, and it's very difficult to reverse, so it's not temporary. It is timely, it can be effected quickly. While on the other hand, what happens with some of the large infrastructure programs, etc., is that their multiplier effect is large, but it's not timely enough. It takes a lot of time to roll it on the ground. One of the things that we have been looking at is that which is the segment in the economy which is most impacted right now. And in our view, that segment is the rural non-agri informal sector. which has taken the brunt of slower growth and formalization. So if the government can devise a scheme which puts money into their hands or able to give them better livelihood, then that would be something which we will be strongly in favor of. And in terms of infra spending, I think the ministry which needs higher allocation definitely is the Urban Development and Housing Ministry.
Really, would you agree with that assessment? And putting more money in the hands of people, does that necessarily lead to more demand? Or is it better for government to look in terms of capital expenditure? Because after all, if you have to choose between consumption-led and investment-led growth, it's well known that fiscal multipliers are much higher with investment-led growth. So where would your preference lie, Indranil? Consumption or investment-led growth?
Well, investment-led growth takes time. By the time you've given the money, the project has been identified, it will take 1-2 years. So clearly you have to now stimulate consumption. And we think that, the best way to do so is put money in the hands of lower income groups, because their propensity to consume presumably is higher. We also think that, there could be an higher interest rate subsidy, maybe 2% higher interest rate subsidy, subvention if you call it, on bank loans to micro and small enterprises, costs just 0.1% of GDP. This is for a year, but then it will shield them from the spike in real lending rates that we have seen. We also think that there should be maybe either an interest rate subsidy or a tax subsidy for home loans, maybe up to, let's say, 90 lakh rupees. So we think that there clearly has to be support that goes to the hands of the people right now, than waits for blueprints and plans, which can happen later. Once this phase is over, you have all the time in the world to stimulate investment.
Samiran, this was the argument that was made last time in July when Nirmala Sitharamn presented her budget, the first budget she presented, at least it was of course for a part of the year. But even so, that was the argument behind giving that quasi-basic income support, etc. But none of that really worked. And why should it take so long for the government to start spending? After all, we've been talking about the fact that there needs to be investment in infrastructure, etc. And we've been talking about it for so many years now, months. So why should it take so long? And are we not always postponing, saying that no, we need to look at the very short term rather than the medium or long term? So Samiran, is this a wise idea to just spend without necessarily creating any asset?
So this is the thing that till now this government, even if they're going to slip on the fiscal deficit target for fiscal year 20, that's not because of any reckless spending. It's more because of the revenue slippage. So the challenge for the finance minister is going to be that to think of a stimulus from an expenditure side, first she has to balance the revenue side. And we have seen that the tax buoyancy numbers have collapsed in FY20. So unless you are having an assumption that these numbers will improve next year, the kitty to spend in itself is lower. And then comes the implementation challenges. If this idea is correct that the finance ministry is not going to allow more than 25% of the full year budget for any ministry in the last quarter, then ministries like roads, railways, and urban development will not be even able to spend their full year budget in FY20 itself. So just allocating a higher amount for certain ministries may not be the solution till the money is properly spent. So we have to think of schemes which works quickly. Like for example, in the 2008-9 crisis, when we had that fiscal stimulus, one of the simplest thing was that the government went ahead and bought a lot of buses for city transport on the JNU-URM. And that was a very quick way of stimulating a particular sector without too much of implementation delays.
Oh, absolutely. I think in the Indian context, implementation has always been our Achilles heel. And surprising as it sounds, you and I might not have a problem of spending money, but Government of India surprisingly seems to be having a problem when it comes to spending money. But I'm afraid it's time for us to slip into a very short break. Please do stay with us. We'll be back very soon. Welcome back. You're watching a very special program that we in ET Now are trying to bring to our viewers on what are the challenges, the opportunities and the macroeconomic fundamentals on the basis of which Nirmala Sitharamn has to frame our budget. I'm in discussion with two experts, Indranil Sengupta as well as Samiran Chakraborty. Indranil, before the break, Samiran was giving the example of how the purchase of buses, the JNURM, etc., was one easy way, apparently it would seem, of getting out of the problems in the post-2008 crisis. Now, are we somewhere like in the 2008 crisis because our growth has slipped to a decadal low? So, do we need that kind of very aggressive kind of fiscal stimulus? Remember, all the talk about crowding out doesn't seem to hold anymore because there is virtually no private investment happening. So, when government is the only game in town, is it not a reason for government to start spending aggressively? And is it so difficult? Should it be so difficult for government to start spending? Indranil?
Well, that is why I think that, if the government were to give, subsidies, interest rate subsidies, just pay the bank. That's all you need to do, right? For loans to SSI or, loans to the home buyer. If the government were to say that, okay, you have here is a direct consumption scheme that, we will give you a cheap loan, interest-free loan, go and buy whatever you want to in the next 3 months. These are schemes which can work very, very quickly because, once the money reaches, the targeted families, whether, the ones that benefit under the CLSS scheme, the ones that are maybe a BPL, the firms which are classified as MSE with the banks. So then, that is something that can happen very, very quickly. In 2008, we had, apart from this buying of buses, there was the advantage that you had the pay commission, the sixth pay commission being implemented in October 2008. So when, the whole world was, so nervous, India's civil service went and bought homes and cars. So what you have to do is just put money in the hands of people very quickly at this point in time. And then, as growth revives, tax collections will go up and you'll recoup all the money that you've spent now.
Okay. But, Samiran, ultimately the government does need to have some revenue in their hands. And at a time when tax revenue is falling short so drastically of the targets, they need to find money somewhere. This is where disinvestment would have been a very easy quote-unquote option. So why has the government found it so difficult to raise money by way of disinvestment? Because that would be one easy cash cow, so it would seem. But the government doesn't seem to be able to do anything about disinvestment. All it's done about roughly 18,000 crores of 1,05,000 crores. That is what we expected for disinvestment this year. So why is it that the government is not able to cash in on this relatively easy fund flow, as it were? Samiran.
I think the intent about divestment is very much there. So in a perverse way, what the shortfall this year will become a boon for the next year. So it's quite likely that for the next year's budget, the government will have a very high divestment target. We think the number could be as large as 1,40,000, 1,50,000 crore for next year. So the challenge really is that when you have not done strategic divestment for a good 15-20 years, suddenly to move into that strategic divestment mode is not also easy, particularly with very large assets to sell. We all understand the complications around it. My only question is that whether we should push it from the beginning of the year rather than in the latter part of the year, which seems to be the case always. And if I may add, we have to go beyond this strategic divestment into monetization of assets, whether it is land assets or other road assets or in other sectors, because in our calculation, simply divestment would not be good enough over a longer period of time. We need to find other ways of supplementing the non-tax revenue.
Indranil, Samiran makes this argument that even though the government is very unlikely to come anywhere close to achieving this year's disinvestment target, they are likely to go in for a much higher target for next year, which raises the issue of credibility. Will that number carry any credibility? And also brings me to the related question of what credibility does the government's fiscal deficit target have. In fact, there's been a lot of talk that there's so many off-budget items that this is a chance for the government to clear up, clean up and come up with a correct estimate of the fiscal deficit. But I'm not really sure that markets are willing and mature enough to look at a fiscal deficit of, say, something close to 5%, which is perhaps where it would be if you were to take all your off-budget items. Remember what happened to Greece? Do we want to have a similar situation in India? What price credibility, Indranil?
So, there is a difference between the fiscal deficit of the country and the public sector borrowing requirement. So, the fiscal deficit as it stands is perfectly fine. What people are talking about is that you take these off-budget, items and say that, that's your public sector borrowing requirement, PSBR. That's number one. Number two, there is a huge difference in the liquidity impact of government borrowing and off-balance sheet borrowing. Let me just give you an example. If you buy a government bond, the money will go to the government account at the RBI, right? So this will reduce liquidity. Instead, if you go and buy a public sector bond, all that happens is money goes from your current account to your, maybe your fixed deposit to the current account of that public sector undertaking. So there is no liquidity impact. So therefore, there is a distinction to be made between, what is the fiscal deficit and what is the public sector borrowing requirement, which of course should be calculated. So that is number one. Number two, if you look at the credibility of the government, the very fact last year that before the elections, it did not let go the fiscal deficit, it actually, tightened on the fiscal side, I think has earned it sufficient credibility. And now that, growth is, at such lows, it is perfectly reasonable and acceptable, I think, in markets for the government to go and spend more and pump prime the economy. So I think that, like I said at the very beginning, the need of the hour is to support the economy through both the fiscal side and the monetary side. And then when growth comes back, you can, tighten on the fiscal side, you can tighten on the monetary side.
Soumya, Indranil made a very passionate case for distinguishing between public sector borrowing, PSBR, as well as the fiscal deficit. And though he has a point, not all of the fiscal deficit is really in terms of public sector borrowing. A lot of the government expenditure is actually deferred, rolled over for the next year. And that is certainly not about off-budget items. So fiscal deficit number would be higher. So is there a case for the government to come clean and say mea culpa? Of course, all governments have done it in the past as well. But is this the right moment to do this kind of mea culpa, Samiran?
So it's a difficult choice that in a year when we are expecting the government to stimulate, in a year when there could be revenue challenges, to have also credible accounting is not going to be easy. But having said that, I think the point is that, as you rightly mentioned, that certain part of the fiscal deficit itself is probably understated, or when the budget gets presented in the beginning of the year, it does not properly take into account those things. And it can work both ways, like something like food subsidy. We know that in the last month of the year, the food subsidy is getting transferred from NSSF into the government account, and in the final account, the food subsidy numbers are much lower than where the budgeted numbers are. But for whatever reason, we are not putting that out in the open in the budget estimates. So these kind of things should get corrected. So today, when we look at things, there's just 2 months left for the year to end, and still the markets don't have a good idea of whether any additional borrowing is going to come or not, because to start with, people have less credibility on the budget numbers. I think that's where announcing more credible numbers would make this fear of slippage go away, and the widening of the term premium that we are seeing, that could be much compressed if that fear is not there.
Oh, absolutely. And then, when you have somebody like the former finance secretary go on record and say that the fiscal deficit is actually much higher, it's a different matter, of course, that when he was in government not so long ago, he was a very fervent defender of these very same numbers. But that is bureaucracy for you, Indranil. But let me just come to my last question before we wind up the show. And that is a somewhat, surprising silence that we are finding this time on recapitalization of public sector banks. It is a fact that India is a bank-driven economy. Now, if you're not going to see bank lending take off once again, the fact is whatever government may do, you're not going to see the economy revive. So what can the government do? Because many of the mistakes, many of the ills, the reason why credit is not taking off is because of solutions which lie outside the budget. What can government do to really assuage the fears, particularly of public sector banks? Will recapitalization help? Should there be any funds set aside for recapitalization, Indranil?
So, recapitalization, I think, is something that will go on, and it doesn't affect the fiscal deficit. It's, as long as you use this recapitalization bond scheme. So that's number one. Number two, the reason why, credit growth is where it is that our real lending rates are still very high. And, what we think next year is that, number one, this core WPI inflation shock will probably work itself out in the first half of the year. And secondly, all the measures that the RBI has taken after Mr. Das took over, it takes 6 to 9 months for 1 rupee of RBI liquidity to become, let's say, 5 rupees of credit. And then, there were elections. So the actual easing, in terms of liquidity really started from June. So maybe, somewhere in the first half of the year, all the measures that the RBI took, all the measures that the Ministry of Finance took to bring down lending rates will also begin to play out. So, I am quite hopeful that, next year we will see loan growth pick up.
Okay, so it's good to end on a hopeful
As
note.
lending rates come down.
But Samira, let me just give you the last word. What would you like to see most of all in the budget? Just one or two things that you'd like to see in the budget. Samiran.
Well, as I said, that a larger allocation for the housing sector, and in my view, the real estate NBFC issue is the main choke point in the economy now. So if the budget is able to address that point, then I think I am also hopeful that the next year will look better than this year.
Okay, so on that very hopeful note, thank you so much, Samiran and Indranil, for joining me in discussion. Thank you also for watching. Remember, all eyes will now be on Nirmala Sitharamn as she rises on the 1st of February to let us see what she unfolds for the country, as well as for all of us watching to see what exactly the FM does. Thank you so much.